And next we have Evolve, The Scourge Wars, book number 1, written by D.W. Belfield. It is 481 pages, $4.99. It is available on Kindle Unlimited. And here's the author's description. Jonathan Slate, former Marine infantry officer and the governor of Texas, has just won his bid for the presidency. When an assassin's bullet takes his life during his victory speech, he is conscripted from the afterlife by the Lord of Light, Lucidus. Slate is thrust into a game-like world of Somnium, where he has been reincarnated into the body of a parasite and given one mission: evolve or die. If he can channel the monster inside and utilize his military and political experience to establish Lucidus' personal army, the Scourge, he might have a chance to evolve before his many enemies find him and send him into a permanent death. Okay, this is like a combination of different genre stories. It starts off with this main character reincarnated as a monster that evolves story, which is a re-monster story, with the main character being dropped on the planet at the behest of a goddess as a snake-like creature that has to learn how to survive and use the RPG system to evolve into different creatures or different evolve with different evolutions and aspects to like live and thrive and essentially to continue existing. It then shifts into something like the invasion of the body snatcher with like some definite gory action and horror. And finally, after the midpoint of the story, the novel shifts into one final time into city building and expansion with notes of the Zerg from StarCraft. So if any of that seems interesting to you, pick this up because I actually thought it was interesting. Personally, I was most interested in the first two parts of the novel. The Remonster evolution part, I thought it was really well written. I thought the actual evolution description of being a creature was entertaining, but I already like those kind of stories, so I was already kind of the audience for that. The second part, where it's almost this invasion of the body center kind of vibe to it, I thought was really neat too. And like I said, some of the deaths and murders there were especially gory. I was like, oh, I'm not really generally into horror, but this was from the monster's perspective, so it's not really horror from their perspective, right? So it was interesting to me. But once it got to that third phase of the novel, it kind of loses me a bit because it veers into well-treaded territory. And not that it's poorly written or anything. It's not. It's just that portion of the stories, I felt like, oh, I read this before in other novels. It deals with kingdom building, which are kind of, they're not the most detailed aspects of the story, but you can definitely see notes of like, oh, some of this stuff is pulled from StarCraft or like inspired by StarCraft and the Zerg from that particular, one of the factions from that series. And you can see a lot of like nods to that. And if you're entertained by that, great. Me, I'm not as into StarCraft, so I looked him like, I was like, oh yeah, that's right. This other reviewer mentioned this. I was like, that's totally true. But from that point on, it feels a little more familiar in that there's just like there's regular action, there's regular expansion, and there's a goal of like expanding the Scourge's territory. And it's not poorly written or anything, but again, it didn't feel as original as the first two portions of that novel. Like the first two portions that I mentioned earlier, like those were definitely more of a highlight for me because they felt like things I hadn't read before. So there's that. So there's kind of an interesting balance of how I was entertained. On the RPG side of things, it's well thought out, nice evolutions. The evolutions in the later part of the story, after the 50% mark, they didn't feel as important as they were to the survival of the main character in the first portions of the story. Not to say they're bad or that they're not well planned or intricate to the story. They just didn't feel as important. Like I felt like if he didn't have those evolutions, he still would have survived some way in the story. But without those evolutions in the first half of the story, no way, not whatsoever. That was a key part of that plotline and the everyday survival of the main character. The city aspects again aren't particularly detailed, but again, nice nods to other things. Overall, interesting story. It is. But I was more intrigued by the first half than the last half. Mentioned why already. There are a few points where they actually feel a little more forced. But other than that, like I said, an interesting story overall. Not bad. I was just more interested in the first half because again, it felt a little more original. For me, good score 7.3 out of 10. That's a good score, entertaining score. That's in a good range. But again, just wasn't as invested in the second half as it was in the first half. Let's Evolve the Scourge Wars, book number 1, with the score 7.3 out of 10.